Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine, and I'm joined now by John Mackenzie. Hi, John.
Hello.
Yeah, we're also delighted to be in the studio. No Seb today, no remote Seb as a result of the technical issues that we had last week. But if anything, it's a blessing, because in Seb's place, it's Liam Twomey of The Athletic. Hi, Liam.
Hello.
How are you doing, all right?
Trying to enjoy a rare hour's respite from news, hopefully.
Sure.
We'll see.
Well, you know, if any news happens, you've got your phone. It's fine. In fact, it might cause a nice dramatic effect if you were to walk out halfway through, pretend you're speaking to Graham Potter's agent or something. That would be a very exciting exclusive for the Tifo Football Podcast. We're not used to them here, but if you like exclusives, that was good.
Very good, well done.
You should get The Athletic. Visit theathletic.com/Tifo, theathletic.com/Tifo for all the world's exclusives. What's the best exclusive you've ever had at The Athletic, Liam?
Oh, blimey. No, on the spot immediately. I'm going to lean into type. We do a bit on our podcast where I'm supposed to be a massive fan of Kai Havertz. So I'm going to say doing an interview with Kai Havertz on breaking down aspects of his game using Y-Scout.
Nice. Was he nice guy?
Yeah, what was he like?
Yeah, he's a very normal guy. It was via Zoom, though, unfortunately, during COVID. But, yeah, he was very good.
I read he loves birds, the animal.
He loves a lot of animals.
Does he?
Yeah, he's really into... He's got dogs. He's got his own dogs, like me.
Yeah.
And
any other similarities between you and Kai?
Both left-footed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's a bit taller than me, but
a little bit.
Other than that, both good in tight spaces.
Sure.
You are unsure of your position on a football field, your best position on a football field.
Yeah, but everyone's sure they have to have me out there. They just don't know where. Yeah, he loves horses, I think, as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, who doesn't love horses? Anyone here?
I'm not the biggest fan of horses, but I'm not an enemy of the horse either.
Horse agnostic.
Yeah, I think so.
No, they exist, but...
Yeah.
John Mackenzie, not an enemy of the horse. But if you want to read high-quality football writing, then you should visit The Athletic. Please do that. Please, please, please do that. I will leave you now in the warm hands and the cool embrace of the dog-owning Liam Twomey. There we go. Okay. Right, let's begin, shall we, with Graham Potter, because, of course, since we spoke last, Thomas Tuchel has lost his job at Chelsea. We'll come on to talk about him a little bit later. Graham Potter was very swiftly anointed the new Chelsea manager, Liam, almost as though there had been plans before Tuchel had lost his job.
Almost. Yeah. We weren't aware of them, obviously, before news of Tuchel's sacking broke, but in the course of making calls and putting together our big long read on Tuchel's sacking, it became quite clear to us that the wheels had been in motion with Potter for a few weeks, and that when Chelsea were looking at Marc Cucurella from Brighton and Todd Boehly flew to Mykonos to put the finishing touches to that deal, he displayed a startling degree of knowledge of all things Graham Potter, his entire career from Östersunds onwards. And
to be fair to Todd Boehly, maybe he just has an encyclopedic knowledge of all football.
Maybe it's possible.
Apart from formations, right?
Well,
not the best at
some people we've spoken to would contest the encyclopedic knowledge of football view of Todd Boehly, but I think it's true that the owners have certainly gained a lot of football knowledge this summer. I think it's been a steep learning curve for them at times, and they haven't been viewed favourably by everyone. But no, they latched on to Potter early as someone that could be a good fit for what they're building at Chelsea. And it got to the stage where when they decided that they wanted Tuchel out, Potter wasn't just a candidate, he was the clear first choice. And then Mauricio Pochettino was mentioned, and they did contact him as the sort of highest profile free agent out there, maybe with Zinedine Zidane as well. But Potter ticked most of the boxes for what they wanted, and that in itself I think is quite interesting, because there's been this desire in some quarters to paint Chelsea's new owners as like the typical splashy new owner coming in, spending $250 million on players in their first window, but normally those types of owners go for a name, don't they? They go for someone who's got a long history of trophies. They go for Jose Mourinho, let's face it.
Well, it sounded like they tried to go for Cristiano Ronaldo as a player, so you would think, therefore, that they would do the same for coach.
Yeah, and that's true. There was certainly, at the very least, a high degree of intrigue over the possibility of signing Ronaldo, and that was a point of tension with Tuchel. And you can talk about how compatible that is with going after Potter, but the fact that they thought Potter was the one for them, I think, is quite interesting and suggests they're at least sincere in their desire to try and build something long term. Whether they're actually going the right way about it is another question.
So I think there's probably, it's fair to say, a split of opinion amongst Chelsea supporters about Tuchel's sacking. We can chat about that in a little bit. But what's the reception to Potter been like so far? Because presumably, out of a complicated situation, you would have thought most supporters are fairly happy about that.
I think Chelsea fans have had a lot of practice at this.
Okay.
With head coaches changing often when they don't want them to. So while there's a lot of sadness and a lot of disappointment from a number of fans about Tuchel going, particularly in such brutal fashion, I think the desire at the very least is to get behind Potter and to show him support early, because they recognise that this could take a little bit of time. And with the amount of new players they've signed and the fact that this squad is clearly changing significantly, this could end up becoming a sort of transition season.
Yeah.
The owners want it to be a transition season which ends in a top 4 finish, but it could well be a bit more of a transition season. So the fans, I think, are broadly on side. There are obviously questions about the fact that Potter hasn't operated at this level before, and you're succeeding a Champions League winning coach. But I think the atmosphere inside the stadium will be positive against Salzburg.
Feels like a bit of a tidal change for Chelsea, doesn't it, John? I know, obviously, new owners have come in, and as Liam said a moment ago, there were a certain set of expectations about what would follow. But the Chelsea that I know are a club that often go for big players, go for big-name managers, try to make a statement, in many cases prior to Tuchel, try to allow the players to sort of find or figure out the solutions to on-pitch problems themselves. Chelsea signing Graham Potter is not really something I'd ever considered before. It feels like similar to what PSG are claiming to be doing at the moment and have done over the summer by signing a lower profile manager and talking more about team play than individuals.
Yeah, I agree, but actually I do think that people downplay the similarities between Tuchel and Potter insofar as I think they're both very similar in terms of the way they approach football. And I did a video last week looking at Graham Potter and what he brings, and a lot of what he does is, I like to call it problem solving. So each phase of play, he's going to say, right, we've got to move the ball from deep possession through the thirds, get it to the final third, and then generate chances. And I think he views each of those phases as a problem to be solved, and has the ability to be flexible to change things around even within games to be able to achieve that kind of thing. And I think Thomas Tuchel is very similar in that respect. I think he's a really elite coach when it comes to moving the ball through the thirds, and both Brighton under Potter and Chelsea under Tuchel have had issues maybe generating the most dangerous chances they can in the final third, which is a different question to be asked. But in many respects, I think the ability to be flexible is quite unique for someone like Thomas Tuchel, being an elite manager at that level. I don't think many managers would want to be as reactive almost as he may be. I think Potter is more reactive, and that's probably because he's at a club where you have to be reactive, because you are going to be a lot of the time playing against teams that are better than you. But the idea of being a flexible manager at an elite side is I guess a little bit counterintuitive, because I think a lot of people expect big managers to just come out and say, we have this squad at our disposal, we have to be proactive, we have to go out there, we have to make the most of this of the squad that we have. Whereas obviously Thomas Tuchel came in and was just very defensive from the start. And I think at the beginning of Tuchel's career, everyone was saying, he's sorting out the defence and then he'll sort out the attack. And I guess you could question whether or not the attack ever got sorted out. But I think that's quite different to the way that a lot of other managers would do it. Maybe we're seeing that a little bit with Erik ten Hag, but I think that he's in a weird situation where he has to sort of work with a squad that isn't as good. Whereas I think Potter goes into the Chelsea job with a squad which is just so deep compared to what he's had before, and so I think he'll just be able to come in, play the same sort of system. I think he'll stick with a back three system. He plays this sort of 3-4-3 with a box in midfield that Tuchel has played, and so I don't think it's going to be a particularly steep learning curve for him. I think that he'll just come in and they'll do what they've done before.
I mean, the changes, though, are what you've highlighted already, that with Brighton, obviously, as a result of the quality of players he does need to be reactive and build his game plan around what sometimes better opposition are going to do. At Chelsea, he doesn't need to do that. But you would have thought, aside from the tactics, that's quite a significant change for a manager. I don't know about Östersund's one of the best teams in the league. Does he have experience of managing the team who are supposed to dominate?
They
ball?
certainly were by the end. He took them over in the fourth tier
Yes.
and took them all the way up to the top. And obviously they had that famous victory against Arsenal in I guess it was the Europa League back then.
But they were underdogs, right?
In that game,
But their identity, if they
sure.
you
I don't disagree with you on that. What I would disagree with you maybe is that Tuchel's. I think
I haven't said anything. You can't disagree with me. Just to be clear,
my base level is that you're wrong.
I won't have you disagree.
We'll start from that base level.
Okay.
So you're wrong, and I think with Tuchel, he the best things that he did at Chelsea in a tactical sense were always reactive, stopping opponents from doing things. So he absolutely had the number of Antonio Conte on most of the games they played. He switched up the system, played a 4-2-2-2 where it was all about stopping Conte's team being able to do the build-ups that we know that they can do. They try and lure people in. They do this really nice passing through the first third, and then you get the ball into your front three, and they're just elite at that. And Thomas Tuchel knew exactly how to stop that. And
a cup manager.
Yeah, you could call him that, where he's going to respond to opponents, and he's going to cause them problems. And I think in the last edition of the Champions League, they obviously had that terrible game against Real Madrid, but then in the second leg of that fixture, actually were very unlucky not to actually see the result through as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities between Potter and Tuchel, and I think that the reason why people think that Tuchel is an elite manager is because he's managed elite clubs. Mm-hmm. That's the only difference between him and Potter necessarily.
Yeah. Well, another aspect of having a new coach, Liam, is their ability to attract players or improve players that are already there. And Jeff Reuter for The Athletic in the US wrote a piece saying that maybe he thinks Christian Pulisic might be a player who could benefit from Potter being there. Do you think there are players in the squad that are maybe missing out at the moment or have higher ceilings and room for improvement that Potter can assist with before we talk about who else he could bring in?
Yeah, I think virtually all the attacking players for a start. That was the big failure of the Tuchel tenure, really. He made Chelsea arguably the best defensive team in the world for the first calendar year he was in charge. The last 9-10 months that fell off, and they didn't have the margin for that to fall off because the attack never improved to a level, certainly to the level of Liverpool or Manchester City, where they could seriously challenge in the Premier League. So I think when you're looking at individual players that can be improved, all of the attacking players, more can be done to maximise them, whether that's a change of system, whether that's slight tweaks of role or starting positions on the pitch, that will be something that Potter has to assess. And the good thing is, with the sort of fixture uncertainty in the next couple of weeks around this Salzburg game, he maybe has more time than he initially thought to work on the training pitch and start putting some things in place, because there will be no room to breathe in October, November. Chelsea just have to recover and prepare for the next game. Yeah. But that was a big bone of contention between Tuchel and the new owners by the end, was that I think part of the analysis the owners did was not just what they saw as the declining trends in his second 50 games versus his first, but also the fact that players were not improving, whether they be young players, and the perception there was that Tuchel didn't particularly trust young players anyway, but even the older players were not improving and not playing at their maximum level, and that will be a key part of Potter's job going forward.
One thing Tuchel does have over Graham Potter is more of a reputation internationally, and I think sometimes it's sort of frustrating for us here at TIFO. The way we like to think about football is, if this player does really well in this particular position and his data shows that, he should be given an opportunity within this team. But more often than not, what happens is, players either choose teams as a result of the reputation of the team, or in some cases the reputation of the manager. And sometimes players don't want to go and play for a team that's coached by a manager that they haven't heard of before. And with Graham Potter, whilst he obviously it has a fantastic reputation in the Premier League now, is it at all going to harm their ability to sign players that Tuchel maybe would have been able to draw?
It's an interesting question, because I remember a little while ago we were working on a piece about what's it like to play for Tuchel, and we'd done similar pieces on Guardiola and Klopp, and with those pieces it was very easy to find player voices, players that were happy to talk about their experiences with Klopp and Guardiola. It wasn't with Tuchel. He's not someone who has that same level of rapport with most of the players that he coaches, and maybe that's part of what limits his shelf life at clubs in the end. And I think an extension of that is that this is also something Chelsea experienced in the summer, is that he isn't necessarily one of those coaches you look at who can draw players to them. Maybe that worked with Aubameyang to an extent, although there were other forces that kind of made it make sense for all parties.
And I think when you've coached a player before, that almost doesn't count, does it? That's like, I mean, obviously it's an indication that they like you and they like how you coach, but really what I mean is being able to draw a player who's aware of your reputation. And
when you're talking about people like Matthijs de Ligt, that didn't work.
Yeah.
He was swayed by Bayern Munich. You talk about someone like Rafinha. Obviously, his dream was to play for Barcelona. It would have been hard for Chelsea to overcome that regardless. But I think in both cases, fair or otherwise, I think the view from ownership was that Tuchel was not necessarily as compelling in his role of persuading those players as he perhaps could have been, certainly as Xavi was at Barcelona, for example, and we've seen Klopp and Guardiola do that in the past. So I'm not actually sure that when we're talking about Potter, the drop-off in that aspect will be particularly noticeable, because I don't think Tuchel was regarded as a major sort of player draw. I think when players sign for Chelsea, usually they're signing for Chelsea for the money, for the prestige, for London, for the chance to compete for the biggest trophies.
Yeah. Okay, John, a tiny bit more on Graham Potter and his tactical approach. He appears to love flexible players. Is there anyone at Chelsea or in the squad or players that stand out that will be of particular use to Tuchel, do you think? Tuchel, Potter, they're the same person, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tuchel's been quite flexible with some of the players, right? And so someone like Reece James, you can play as a wing back, or you can play him as on the outside of the centre back. And we've seen
the
Tuchel,
best player in the squad. You mean Reece James? Is that? Should we say that now? Reece James, best player in the
squad. I
squad
wrote quite recently he's the most complete footballer in the squad, and I think that's pretty solid at this stage.
Well, as I've already said, my position is that you're wrong, so we'll go with that.
What a shame that's extended to Liam as well.
Sorry to
just collateral, aren't I?
Caught in the crossfire. But we've seen him use Loftus-Cheek as a wing back as well.
Yeah.
In quite an interesting way, in that it allowed. So people will all say, "Why play Reece James as an outside centre back? You're losing something doing that." But it does allow you to push Loftus-Cheek inverted into that front line, and gives you space then for James to run into as well. So I think that the part and parcel of being a good flexible manager is that your players have different roles in different situations and they know what they're doing. That's what we've seen Potter do at Brighton. We've seen him use Alexis McAllister just all over the pitch, and he's been used as a pivot player in a deep lying sense this season, which we haven't really seen much before that. And Leandro Trossard was brought in as a sort of classic winger, and we thought that we would see him a lot on the outside of a front three. We've seen him play as a wing back as well for Brighton on both sides at times as well. So I think that again it's just quite a nice crossover. I think that when you get someone like Tuchel, you get someone like Potter, these players are getting a footballing education. It's not just sort of like, oh, you are this player in this position, this is what you do. The idea is that in certain games they'll be being told this is what your role is. These in this phase of play do this, in this phase of play do that. And again, I just think that's quite a nice cross. It's weird because it's like so much of what we've heard about the Bowley what do we call it, regime,
takeover.
That's too hard. Too harsh.
The regime.
That is too harsh.
The
reign of Todd Bowley. Long may he reign over us. But,
yes, of course.
I think we've talked already about.
Hello.
We've talked already about how I completely forgot what I was going to say.
I don't know what you.
We've talked already about how Todd Bowley, like we expected him to do like American owner things, right? Which is do things like bring in Cristiano Ronaldo. But it does strike me that
eat a mac and cheese.
Yes, that famous American activity. But I actually think that this is quite a sense. It's like it makes so much sense to me as a sort of reign of succession. So
okay. Liam, David Ornstein reports this morning in a fantastic column on The Athletic. N'Golo Kanté at the moment not signing a new contract. He's got 1 year left on his deal. I mean, I think a bit of a waning influence anyway, right? I know it sounds horrible to say anything bad about N'Golo Kanté because I feel like everyone loves him. But I think it is clear that with his current injury record and with potentially his age and the amount that he's presumably had to run over the last 6, 7, 8 years, he appears to be a waning influence on the team. Is this kind of the perfect scenario? Do you really want to sign N'Golo Kanté down to another 3 or 4 year contract?
I don't think it's a straightforward decision for the owners, because they've already shown, in the case of Kalidou Koulibaly and Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, that they are, and of course Azpilicueta, keeping him, that they are prepared to go beyond the 1 year policy that the old Chelsea ownership had for players over the age of 30, if that player is deemed to be useful on the pitch, but also useful off the pitch in terms of culture, dressing room harmony, everything like that, leadership. And Kanté kind of ticks. He's obviously not the most vocal presence, but he is a very good veteran in that sense, in that he sets an exceptional example day to day. And even on the pitch, it's kind of a bit of a dilemma still, because when he plays, as you saw against Tottenham, which was pretty much the only good performance Chelsea have had this season under Tuchel, he's phenomenal still. He can still absolutely own a game. But it just doesn't happen as often. Last year he played 50-60% of the matches across all competitions, and the last couple of years it's been that way. It feels like injuries have been a much more persistent part of his story ever since the Europa League final in 2019.
In terms of the wages that he's on, can I get a sense of like how highly paid he is within the realms of the dressing room? Presumably he's an upper earner, right?
So until Romelu Lukaku signed, he was the highest earner at Chelsea.
Was he really?
200, in the region of £290,000 a week.
So this contract that they're offering him, can we assume that it is either for the same amount of money or less?
I'm not sure.
We don't know.
I'm not sure. And I think that's another interesting aspect of the discussion, because according to David's information, Chelsea have offered a 2+1, similar to the deal they offered Aubameyang, with, I presume, performance incentives or maybe appearance incentives in that second year to trigger the third. Kanté wants 3 years guaranteed, which I guess from his perspective, looking at what he's done for the club, but also looking at the contracts given to Koulibaly, he and as Azpilicueta would say, well, look, you are showing a bit more leeway now. But there could be a little bit of a back and forth there in terms of, well, if you want the guaranteed third year, then can you come down on salary? Because Chelsea would maybe be more prepared to do that. This is just me surmising, but I think it would be less of a load on the wage bill, which is what the owners are thinking about now. To bring him back for 3 guaranteed years on the money he's on at this point in time doesn't seem particularly feasible to me.
Even if he is a legend.
Yeah, and I think while they are paying for culture and sort of less tangible things, they're not paying for sentimentality. So that's not going to be the starting point of any of these conversations.
Americans hate sentimentality, don't they, Liam? It's part of the culture. They're so keen to just let go of the past.
Well, they're just relentlessly business-minded, I think, the new owners. And that's another thing that I think it's been easy to overlook because they've been throwing money around in the transfer market and £200 million net spend. This is not going to be the way things are going forward once there's a sporting director and a sporting structure in.
Is that tricky for Potter? Because, they have just spent £250 million. And I know we're only a couple of months away from January. A very easy argument to make to Graham Potter that you've got all the players here that you need. And I would have thought one of the, part of the interview process would have been, do you think you can work with the squad that we have? And I imagine Graham Potter would have said yes. But we've seen a lot recently of managers just buying players from clubs that they've previously managed. Do you think there's a chance at all that Potter might be looking back to Brighton in January to pick someone up? I don't know.
Well, he sent Cucurella on ahead, didn't he?
There you go.
So he's already got one.
The scouting party returned successful.
I would be surprised if that happened. I think if Chelsea went in for any Brighton players, then it would have to be a decision based on that player's merits. But the conversation had with Potter would have been, you're a head coach, can you coach this group of players? And when they're talking about this group of players, they're not just talking about the senior squad, they're also talking about like Carney, Chukwuemeka, Cesare Casadei, these young players that they've spent a lot of money to bring in. It was made very clear when Chukwuemeka signed that he wasn't going into the development squad, although he has played for them a couple of times. He was training with the first team. It's with a view to him trying to earn first team minutes. So I think that's one example of something that Potter will have to look as look at as an option, because remember after the Southampton defeat, Tuchel turning around saying we've got no one left to play in central midfield, and he'd left Billy Gilmour and Chukwuemeka unused among his substitutes.
Well, on Billy Gilmour as well, he's obviously gone to Brighton fairly recently. Can we take that as an indication that Graham Potter doesn't want to use him at Chelsea? If the conversations have been going on for a month or so, we can't take that as a... I mean, it's quite a funny idea though, isn't it, Liam? What do you think?
My understanding is that I think in the conversations that Gilmour had and that Gilmour's people had with Chelsea before going to Brighton, it was sort of intimated that, look, stick around, see what happens, the situation could change.
Yeah.
Were they winking, really?
But obviously at that point, things had reached a stage with Gilmour. He'd been cut from the pre-season squad. He'd lost his squad number. He'd already spent a less than satisfying year on loan at Norwich. He wanted some stability, but he also wanted somewhere that would guarantee his career moving on an upward trajectory again. And so I think he signed for Brighton. Yeah, Potter was a significant part of that because everything Potter's done with the team and the chance to work with him, but I don't think it was all of it.
Okay.
And, the sense I've got since, the feeling is you can't hang around in the hope that a manager will get sacked. I know players have done that at Chelsea in the past and it's paid off, but they made a decision for his career. And I think if you're looking at the long-term strategy of Brighton beyond Potter, we're going to talk about that later, aren't we? Whoever they appoint in place of him is going to try and fit that same vision for developing young players and running sustainably. So that should still fit what Gilmour is looking for.
Look at that, a professional podcaster over there, a trail ahead. Imagine.
Thank you.
Pod shadowing.
Steve Hankey's very proud of you. Listen, let's have a break now, and when we come back, we'll talk a bit more about Thomas Tuchel.
It almost looks like Graham Potter's new desk at Cobham. Did you see that on his first interview video? It's just all very minimalist. There's just like a stapler in the corner by the window, and just nothing else.
Was that Thomas's staple?
Yeah, he's left it.
Yeah.
Well, it seemed to be playing a dangerously high line towards the window. So maybe that was what Tuchel was. His last message.
Podcast gold. Shame it was in the break. Anyway. Thomas Tuchel, if you hadn't worked out already, has left Chelsea. We've talked a little bit, Liam, about what happened, but just give us a précis of because it was a bit of a surprise to me.
Yeah, and it was a surprise to me as well, only in terms of the timing. I mean, based on the things we'd heard in the summer, little rumblings here and there that things weren't great between him and the owners, and we'd been hearing for longer than that, back to January of this year, some of which we'd reported about player discontent, particularly among the attackers, about the way Tuchel was managing them. So it wasn't a shock, but it was a surprise that it was happening so early in the season and 5 days after the close of a transfer window in which he had been quite active, at least at the start.
Well, that's one thing, but also you wrote, I think, that Tuchel also sort of believed that in principle they'd agreed another deal. So it must have come as a bit of a surprise to him.
Yeah, he was absolutely shocked. I mean, when we rewind to that Dinamo game, the big piece that we did starts with them getting onto the plane from Zagreb back to England, and the owners are on the front of the plane, Egbali and Bowley, with Tuchel and his coaching staff, and there's nothing being said there. It's completely silent at the front of the plane. But he doesn't know at that point. He doesn't know until the next morning when he gets a summons to a conference call and is, very quickly,
summarily,
politely let go. Yeah, we want to go in a different direction.
That's awkward for everyone, isn't it, on the plane? I mean, also because it's the right thing to do, presumably, as a person, not to sack someone on a plane. Where they can't leave, and then also, but if you've made the decision, I mean, it will feel like an emotional betrayal. But also, it happens on a plane to be maybe the right thing to do.
Kind of workshop
snakes on a plane.
Well, it wasn't just the plane. When they landed at Southend, so they had a 90-minute drive on the bus, where the same scene plays out twice, where they're on the plane, on the bus, and the players just have to awkwardly file through.
Sure. We've all been in a relationship like that, though, haven't we? Where we've had to do an awkward train journey or a bus journey.
I'm just waiting to dispatch my wife. Another 10 years, I think, before I work up the courage summarily.
Will you do a conference call for that one as well?
Probably, yeah. I'll involve you, John. You've been, you're a model employee here. I'm sure it'll work out just
So
fine.
speaking of me being a model employee, someone reminded me the other day that on a very early edition of this podcast, I say very early, in my era, in the John Mackenzie era,
extremely
I
recent.
pointed out that Thomas Tuchel might be one of the first managers to go this season.
Did you? Yeah, okay.
So just write that in your book of model employees.
Well, there's no need because you've said it on a podcast now,
Okay,
haven't
so
you?
it's
A
recorded
little
for
moment of
perpetuity.
I was right.
I was right,
I
yeah.
said this a while ago.
Is prophecy an essential quality
Yeah.
of a model employee?
If anything, it's discouraged because it's quite smarmy, isn't it? And we don't like it here.
Sorry.
Yeah. Are there any other
not-for-profit organisation? Are
Are there any other nice details, juicy morsels, Liam?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, on the sort of player management side of things, you hear things before the decision, but then you hear a lot more after the decision. And in the course of the conversations we were having with people, we heard quite a few things that were quite damning and sort of pushed Tuchel's authority over the dressing room beyond the point of no return. One of which was during pre-season, he had 2 separate player meetings, one for players that were happy to stay and fight for the club, and one for players who were either uncertain about their futures or who wanted to leave.
Wow.
So that immediately divides the dressing room. But then you get to the opening weekend against Everton, and some of the players who'd wanted to leave are in the squad, and some of the players who'd wanted to stay are not.
Yeah.
And so, one person we were talking to described that to me as, once you do something like that, you can't really come back from it from a dressing room perspective.
So how did he not know? I mean, like we said, he was really surprised to be fired. Maybe that's right, but he must have known that he was losing the dressing room. If by the sounds of it, lots of players had lost confidence in him.
I think he knew I think he knew going into the summer there was a lot of discontent in the dressing room, which is why he was pushing for so many new signings.
Right.
Because Chelsea went into the summer with 5 of their 7 attackers, everyone bar Mount and Havertz, really actively wanting to leave.
Yeah.
And of course, there was essential surgery needed in other areas of the squad as well. So Tuchel had an inkling, certainly in some cases a lot more than an inkling, about players really not getting on with him and wanting out. But I think a new season starts, and you just hope something will happen that turns things around, and you hope that you've changed enough players where you can change the mood and build a new group. But at the same time, I think a lot of players felt that Tuchel had changed over the course of his tenure as well. When he first came in, he was this really positive force day to day. There was that. It is the classic sort of honeymoon period when a coach comes in. He was replacing a manager who'd ended up dividing the dressing room towards the end, and he brought everyone together, clean slate. Everyone felt that they had an opportunity. The training was fresh. Everyone was invested, and then over time that gets harder to maintain. And if you make mistakes from a man management perspective, if you're harsh with players, that can feed into a broader mood. And I think by the end, things were similar to the way they were at the end of Lampard's time.
Yeah.
And so Potter now is in the position that Tuchel was in back then, of trying to bring everyone together, assure them they're all starting from a level playing field again.
Yeah.
And the challenge will be maintaining that.
It's quite interesting, isn't it, like to think about football managers getting fired, because they get fired so often that you would have thought they're quite used to it and not afraid of it in the way that you guys and me might be.
I'm terrified. That's why I keep bringing up my perfect record as
and
an employee.
would have preferred you to keep that level of anticipation.
Yeah. Well, and a multi-million-pound payoff is not the worst safety net, is it? So I think.
Is the thing.
Wait, we have a multi-million-pound payoff. Right, I'm going to start arguing I'm a terrible employee. It's simply not worth it.
Yeah, I'm always very careful. I mean, again, I get a lot of practice about talking about managerial sackings and appointments covering Chelsea, but I'm always very mindful of the fact that we have to keep this conversation in perspective, because the stakes are not that high here. It's a professional blow. There's some serious ego bruising, but Thomas Tuchel will be okay.
Well, then also, I can't remember where I heard this. It was on another podcast. It might have been the Stadio podcast with Ryan and Musa. But somewhere, anyway, maybe I falsely attributed that, was saying being sacked from Chelsea is not really a career blow. Like, it happens to loads of managers, And there's loads of examples of managers being sacked from Chelsea that then go on to have arguably better jobs elsewhere. With Tuchel specifically, you think if he's been sacked a few times already, you get quite used to it. You might as well, if the owners are going to spend loads of money, you might as well try and buy 5 or 6, 7 players and change the dressing room. Why not go out on a bang? Because it doesn't really seem to make any difference, with the exception of maybe harming your future job.
Well, Roberto Di Matteo won the Champions League with Chelsea, didn't he?
Sure.
And I couldn't name his job right now.
No, that's true. But he was a temporary manager, wasn't he? He was the was he, or did they?
Yeah, he was.
He got it permanently, but not for long.
Did he get it permanently after they won?
Yeah, it always felt like that was Abramovich's most reluctant appointment. That it was kind of
the
almost fan.
It
was one of the few times Abramovich bowed to fan pressure, I think, to give him the job.
Okay.
But the one way you could say that this might affect Tuchel's future employment prospects is just that it's another club that has ended with him falling out with the people above him. And there's a really good piece on The Athletic from Rafa Honigstein talking more about Tuchel's past, and that was a big factor at Dortmund. It was a big factor again at PSG, and with each of these individual clubs, there's plenty of mitigation. You can explain it away, but when it happens again and again, and you're the constant,
pattern you see.
Then owners of other elite European clubs are going to start looking at it and thinking. I think this actually happened with Antonio Conte as well. You can get a reputation for being very difficult to manage.
Yeah.
A high maintenance coach.
You hear that, John?
Sounds like he needs a master's in emotional intelligence or something, doesn't it?
Well, it does sound like that. Steve Hankey, you've put a lovely little fact here in the podcast plan.
Yeah, so we're talking about Roberto Di Matteo, last job that he had after winning the Champions League, then getting sacked. Obviously went to West Brom afterwards. That didn't go well. Went to Schalke. Also didn't go. But okay. His last job was Aston Villa when they were in the Championship under Dr. Tony Chi.
Yes, of course.
Remember that era?
Yes.
That lasted 4 months.
Yeah.
And he hasn't had a managerial job since.
Well, some exceptions to the rule, weren't there? But speaking of Tuchel and his next job, John, we had a chat about this the other day. They did talk about this on the Stadio podcast, which I encourage people to go and listen to, by the way, a lovely football podcast. They suggested Juventus, which is quite a nice suggestion, isn't it? It sort of feels fitting. And because at the minute as well, Max Allegri, not really doing that well.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots to talk about here, isn't there? I think there's, even before we get to two of the things you mentioned there, I think just the context of who elite managers manage now has changed so much in 5 years that it's kind of interesting to think about the level of job that Tuchel would agree to. And one of the things we've seen in the transfer market for players is clubs in the Premier League being able to have a much bigger pull on players than even elite teams around Europe. So I wonder whether or not the same thing will be true in terms of managers. I think maybe slightly different with managers. But
how are you defining elite managers?
This is a question that I was hoping that you wouldn't ask.
Oh, well, you can blame Steve Hankey because he wrote it in the podcast plan. And then highlighted it.
He's trying to undermine me, see?
And then
That's
started
what's going
breathing
on here.
deeply behind me as if to say, say it, Joe, read what I've written, be my puppet.
I guess an elite manager for me nowadays is one of two things, right? One of them is going to be a manager who can get the most out of a squad of really elite players. Please don't ask me to define elite players.
You are creating more questions with your answer, though, aren't you?
But then I think what the expectation has generally been in the last...
Steve has written, please define elite players. You just carry on. Ignore him.
I'm ignoring it.
He's
You do it.
creating
I need to
chaos
just have your
this week,
confidence
isn't
in
it?
just...
Just tell him to off and carry on.
I wouldn't ever do that.
Or swear, because then he has to bleep it out.
Yeah, just throw in...
Create extra
Shall I
work for him later.
Swear every minute.
Yeah, do it. Don't do that.
The other group of managers, I think, is, and the expectation has been over the last decade, I think the elite manager has to be able to have plans for each phase of the game. They have to be able to press. Their teams have to be able to press well. They have to be able to build up well, etc. They have to just be good across the board. So yeah, you would think that Tuchel would go to a big job like a Juventus, but I suppose the question is, like, what level of Premier League team would Tuchel accept? Like, would he accept the next level down? I don't know. Like, I mean, even maybe a job like the Arsenal job, like, would that be the sort of job that he would take? I think that's an interesting conversation.
If Mikel Arteta wasn't there, surely he would accept the Arsenal job.
I suspect so. Yeah.
What do you think, Liam?
Well, what's quite interesting in this is that we've heard before that Tuchel has previously considered whether he might be better served working one level down from the kind of elite European super clubs, where you'd have a dressing room.
How do you define elite? No, carry on, please.
Where you have a dressing room of players who maybe aren't quite the same profile, but they're more malleable to your methods, and they're more willing to accept your methods for a long period of time.
It's so interesting with like Potter as well, right? Because it feels like he's making the opposite move, right? He's going from that kind of club to the elite level. So, yeah.
They say, I imagine Atletico Madrid would count in the elite, but Stadio suggested Atletico as well, which is quite interesting. I mean, in terms of character, that all sort of seems to fit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I thought Juventus actually clicked when you said it, because I think they're in a similar kind of situation, maybe not quite as extreme as they were when they appointed Conte, where they've been full circle, haven't they? Yeah. They got to a point where it wasn't enough to win; they had to win a certain way, and now they just want to win again because they haven't won in a while. And I think if you're in that frame of mind, a coach like Tuchel, who's just going to elevate you tactically back to the very top level.
Yeah, they want the Champions League, don't they?
It's a good choice.
Right, so, and we've already said that Tuchel is maybe a bit more of a cup manager. We've already seen that he can win the Champions League and get his teams to the final. He's done it with 2 teams now. So that's what Juventus originally wanted when they got rid of Max Allegri, right? Because Max Allegri and Conte were not winning the Champions League for them, and they then went through that phase of sort of being a little bit more experimental. But it does make, like, Tuchel does make a certain amount of sense.
It's also not that difficult to imagine Max Allegri leaving at some point this year. And of course, speaking of Juventus, something very strange happened over the weekend, John, with a goal that was disallowed by a header scored by Arkadiusz Milik, who then proceeded to take his shirt off in celebration, had already been booked, had a second yellow card, and was red carded before the goal was disallowed. Yeah. And then I think several other players were also red carded.
And Allegri himself.
What the hell happened?
The funniest thing is that actually it came out that they VAR. So the goal gets overturned, which is the cause of all of these red cards.
Because one player appeared to be interfering offside.
Yeah.
But there's an argument as to whether.
So you can argue about that, like whether or not he was interfering with play. But he was onside anyway, because Candreva was marking the corner, like on the line, and so when the ball comes in, like. Bonucci's just about 50 centimetres onside, like clearly onside.
Right.
The VAR just haven't clocked that he's there because he's sort of close to the corner taker.
Oh dear.
And they apparently didn't have the correct angle, the VAR, to be able to...
How does the VAR not have the correct angle?
So in some, it was quite funny. So Juventus were 2-0 down. They pulled back to, or should have won 3-2.
Right.
But actually didn't end up winning because VAR messed it up.
Right.
And... I could have sworn then, and I didn't. You're so lucky. But yeah, it's a sort of weird situation now because Allegri started off badly this season, and this is a kind of weird result where obviously they've dropped points against a team that they shouldn't be dropping points against, but they've got a good excuse for that not happening. So it's sort of a little bit of a twilight game in terms of the people who want Allegri in and the people who want Allegri out.
Yeah. Okay, well that's funny. Go and watch that if you have time. We'll come back after a break and talk about Brighton. Brighton, the nice place. Graham Potter's left there now, and of course they'll be looking for new managers. John, Andy Peeler, not Andy Peeler.
I thought you were going to say Andy Peters.
Andy Peters, he's the new manager. Andy Peters. No, Andy Peeler of the Athletic. Andy Naylor, of course, I'm referring to.
What is Andy Peters doing these days?
I don't know who Andy Peters is. I was
just
trying to join in the riff.
Live and kicking back in the day.
Alive and kicking.
He's had a very Roberto Di Matteo sort of career.
Would he make a good Brighton manager? It's possible. Andy Peters, let's look.
Do you not remember Andy Peters? Is it before? Oh, that's depressing.
Maybe it's before my time.
So it's Andy with a Y.
Andy with an I. Yeah, I recognise Andy Peters.
Certainly an elite Saturday morning children's TV presenter.
And is there anything more really to being Brighton manager? Who could say the squad's so good it manages itself? But Andy Naylor doesn't think so. Andy Naylor of the Athletic, who's written a piece about this. If you want to whet your appetite with that. But John, there's a few different names circling the drain of Brighton. No, circling the golden trophy of Brighton. Who are they?
Who's circling?
Who are the names?
Seagulls. That would have been a nice metaphor.
Oh God, that would have been good, wouldn't it? Yeah.
And you could have even just gone into the
following the trauma
of
Brighton, the managerial job. Who are these people, so that you can pronounce the first name and not me?
I asked my Norwegian friend how you pronounce this, and he didn't get back to me. So
Right.
thanks, Mads. But I'm saying Kjetil Knutsen because I've heard people say that before.
Okay.
He's the current.
KJ.
Yeah, I don't know how you say it, but whatever. Like,
Bodo Glimt manager.
yeah,
Bodo Glimt, the team I heard oft mentioned recently. Why is that? Are they good?
they've been pretty good in European competitions. So they had that famous, I think, it's 6-0 win over Jose Mourinho's Roma.
Oh yes,
in
that
the
was them.
Group stages, yes, that was them, and they're playing like a super fun brand of football, high pressing, super positional stuff. So like
They're in Arsenal's Europa League group this year, I believe.
yes,
Yeah.
and so they're sort of playing like attractive football, TM. So
Right.
he's obviously on people's radars because of this.
Okay.
It does seem as though Brighton have sort of gone through the list of like who are the up and coming managers around Europe. So
Sure.
Knutsen should definitely be on that list, and I think that it would just be fun. Like any of these managers would be fun. Ange Postecoglou was mentioned as well. Very similar to Kjetil Knutsen as well. So
Sure.
high pressing, high intensity, lots of positional
Ange
stuff.
Postecoglou, I can say recently, by the way, I've realised is the middle of your Venn diagram with JJ, because JJ's Scottish, and so therefore, and you just like possession football, and so therefore, and there in the middle, Ange Postecoglou, Celtic manager.
You're saying that my Venn diagram is possession football, and
his is
JJ's
Scottish,
is
yeah.
Scottish, and they just managed to.
And it gives you this blind spot about how popular Celtic really are. Anyway, just in terms of making YouTube videos for a wider audience, not within Scotland. Don't worry, Scotland, it's all fine. Roberto De Zerbi is the next one.
Another fun manager.
Yeah.
Slightly different to the other two we just mentioned, but again, another manager who has really interesting ideas in possession.
How so different?
So I would say that De Zerbi is probably closer to someone like Antonio Conte in that he likes to have his team do really deep build-up and bait oppositions in to generate space ahead of them, but does it to like an incredible degree. So you'll see you'll see 8 players for his teams in the penalty area in build-up, sort of really baiting the opposition in. And then in terms of like forward areas, like quite a few interesting ideas. So again, he's a possession manager, but usually when we talk about possession managers, they usually want to create space when they have the ball. But I think De Zerbi is doing interesting things in terms of like possession but with narrowness, so that you can then spring counter pressures, because that's the big debate in terms of like if you're going to play counter pressing football, if you're a possession side, you want to win the ball back quickly so that you don't get countered on, but you also want to get space, and he sort of developed this hybrid idea of being able to be narrower in possession, so do a lot of sort of rondo work. So again, it's some similar stuff to what we're seeing in deep possession, like really intricate passing plays to get the ball through as well. So yeah, I think again he would. It's funny for me to sort of talk about this because these are managers that I would just love to see in the Premier League. Whether or not I would love to see them as a fan of that team, I don't know. But I think these are all super exciting managers who it would be great to have in the Premier League.
Liam, if you were to pick a manager for Brighton, and it need not be one of these types, who would you pick?
I mean, I think someone like Thomas Frank was linked from Brentford, and that feels like it would be a good fit. Probably one of the more expensive choices, I would imagine, because you're signing him from the less established Brighton.
The other one,
essentially.
Yeah.
And Brentford are certainly no mugs, so I doubt they would let him go cheaply. But he does seem like, in terms of his way of working, pragmatic but very sort of sophisticated view of football and setting up teams, that he would fit with the culture there. Whoever comes in will have to bring a fairly extensive coaching team, won't they? Because Potter has taken pretty much everything bar the furniture with him to Chelsea.
And the staplers. Yeah. I would choose Ian Evert of Bolton, because A, I'm a cool guy, and B, I spoke to him once, and he seemed very intelligent to me. He really did. It doesn't take that much to impress me, but he seemed like a good one. He was the one. If you're a subscriber to The Athletic, go back and find the Barcelona piece that Stuart James wrote a couple of years ago. That was very interesting when he was at AFC Barrow, non-league team, and managed to get them playing like Barcelona. You got that, didn't you? You got that. Yeah.
AFC Barrow.
Yeah, AFC Barrow. Who would you pick there, John?
I mean, any of those three that we mentioned.
Yeah.
But I think Thomas Frank's a good shout as well. I wouldn't pick Ian Evert.
Right.
Because you're wrong.
Okay. Well, that's good to know, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's good to know. Fine. Okay. Well, finally then, before we finish, A question from Jack Elderton. Yeah, and John, I asked you beforehand if you thought this was interesting, and you said yes. So I'm going to ask you the question.
I didn't see this question.
Could you
until
guys
right now.
cover what David Moyes is doing at West Ham, playing a hybrid system between a back four and a back five? The left centre-back becomes a left-back, the left wing-back becomes a left winger or left central midfielder. The way it's being implemented, high press versus first phase, low block versus everything else, is kind of cool, and you can see how Paqueta could explode in this system, John.
Yeah, I've not thought about this at all until this very moment, but yeah, it's what we're seeing.
Fresh thoughts here from the top of Mackenzie's head. And go.
I'm really going to have to impress you here now, aren't I? So
yeah.
I'm feeling the pressure.
Good.
This is something that we're seeing a lot happening now in Premier League football. So the ability to shift between systems. The interesting thing about David Moyes, I suspect, in the last few seasons has been that his team are obviously like really well structured defensively, and they've struggled to be a team that are expected to win more. So I think they're pretty good at playing underdog football. So sort of playing solid defence, but then having the ability to have players like Jared Bowen, Mikel Antonio, Said Benrahma, players like that who are going to be hit on the break quickly. And it's, a lot of teams are happy to sort of come out against West Ham, so West Ham can cause some problems. But obviously, when you do that to a certain amount of times, teams lower down the table suddenly say, well, what's the point of trying to come out against West Ham?
Yeah.
Let's just sit deep against them, and then you're in this situation where you have to
a very boring game of football sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing, I think, more of now is teams thinking of ways to just manipulate their structure so that they can push players forward in certain attacking phases. So yeah, you're playing with a back five, but you can also form a situational back four. Allows you to get an extra player forward, because if you're playing with a back five, you're obviously taking a player from the forward line and bringing them out. So you see a lot of managers now using creative ways of trying to get that player that they've taken out of further up the pitch into forward play. So yeah, I don't think Moyes is particularly unique in doing this, but he does have to do something, I think, he's one of those managers, right, who I think he benefited a lot from the pandemic in that his team were playing quite structured football, not too energetic football, so that it didn't matter, because a lot of the teams who were playing like really intense presses were struggling. But so
I also would like to say, before I watched the Arsenal All or Nothing series, I had no idea the extent to which footballers were using the energy of the crowd to further them on through holding light bulbs and such.
So I think that they definitely benefited from that, and then the big question became, once they'd moved up that level to being like a mid-table side who should be pressing for Europe, whether or not they had the in-possession stuff to do it. And so I'm sure this is part of that. But
okay, one more question from Scene here. Scene asks, would love to hear you all talk about Ivan Toney and the potential for him to be in England's World Cup squad alongside Tammy Abraham and Harry Kane. I'm throwing that at you, Liam.
Yeah, he's had an excellent start to the season, hasn't he? And he seems to do a lot of the little things, the less glamorous things that focal point number nines increasingly don't do. I mean, the last one at Chelsea that really fit that pattern was Olivier Giroud. But he's also got the goals, and if he can carry on scoring at the rate at which he started the season, maybe he's on a little bit of a hot streak, but if he can get to at least 15 goals and really facilitate a very successful Brentford attack, he's got a strong case, I think, because he's that kind of striker is a player that you can build a winning team around, because they just make players around them better. They link up with midfield runners, create space for others. They can win the ball in the air. So whether you're playing sort of a high-level possession approach against lesser teams, they can maybe offer you a different way through there. But if you're on the back foot against elite teams, don't ask me to define elite teams, which England have been in the latter stages of previous tournaments, he can offer maybe a more effective outball and release valve. And he's also mobile enough to chase the ball if you don't plonk it straight onto his head or chest. So yeah, I think he's got a good case to at least argue for inclusion. But there are some pretty strong contenders. I think Tammy Abraham's really blossomed and rounded out his game in Italy.
Well,
and Harry Kane started brilliantly.
I was going to ask you about Tammy Abraham, because Gareth Southgate was in Italy recently watching the games. I know that he saw Roma lose 4-0 to Udinese, which probably isn't going to help Tammy Abraham's claim, but then it's not necessarily his fault. Do you think there's a chance that, because one would think that Tammy Abraham goes to Roma and plays every week, scores lots of goals in Serie A, that's surely going to help his chances of playing for England. Ivan Toney does that in the Premier League every week, where like many England fans watch that league as opposed to Serie A. Do you think it hurts Tammy Abraham's chances at all that he's doing it in Italy? It certainly shouldn't, but do you think it might do?
Well, there's an argument as to whether it hurt Fikayo Tomori's chances last season that he was playing so well in Serie A rather than in the Premier League. I think if you asked Southgate, he would deny that and say, look, I am making the effort to go to Italy. Even when I'm not going to Italy, I am watching these guys. I'm keeping an eye on them. But as long as you have more cases like Tomori not getting in the squad, you have the sense.
And he's amazing, right?
Well, he's just had a career year, you know, and been the most regular outfield starter on a title team. So I think that will be the perception until Southgate actively changes it. But my theory with the way Southgate picks his squads is more that he just favours guys who've been in his system for a while, or like been in the orbit of the squad for a while, and he tends to be quite conservative in that sense. So if you've been out of the loop for a little while, it can be quite difficult for you to get back in. But Abraham, that could be a counterbalance with him versus Toney, because Toney has been completely outside the England stratosphere for most of his career. He's a real late bloomer in that sense, whereas Abraham was capped. I think Southgate gave him his first England cap. I think that's right, before a lot of people would have. So he's clearly a big believer in his talent. I think if he sees him scoring a lot of goals in a major European league, and if Abraham can maybe build on that with European performances as well. Roma in Europe this year?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so
yes.
Well, they won the Conference League last year, didn't they? So they must be.
Of course they did.
Yeah, so they must be. Yeah. So yeah, if he can build on that on the European stage as well, and maybe Roma make a good Europa League run, that can help him.
Okay, what do you think, John?
I think Tammy Abraham is one of the top 10 strikers in the world. So that's my position on Abraham. Okay. With Ivan Toney, I think, as Liam says, he's clearly on a hot streak right now, and I think that probably affects people's view of what he is good and isn't good at.
Are you sort of saying different stratospheres?
Between Abraham and Toney, I think so. No, I rate Ivan Toney, but I think that were he not scoring as many goals, and I know that's a hypothetical, most people will say, well, he is. Yeah. But, he's scoring at a rate right now that he won't maintain for the rest of the season.
I mean, if Calvert-Lewin was fit, would this even be a conversation?
I can't even remember the last time I watched Calvert-Lewin play. It feels like a long time ago, doesn't it?
I just remember him in the first half of that first season under Carlo Ancelotti when he was amazing. Yeah, no,
of course.
But
the other thing to add to this as well is that probably the biggest issue that Toney would have when you're projecting forward to the World Cup is there just isn't a lot of time for someone who hasn't been in Southgate's thinking up to this point to break into that squad. You've got one international break between now and then, and if you're not picked for that squad, realistically, it's over.
Unless there's like a big injury, I guess.
Is that this? Are they picking the squad this week?
Yeah, it's international break next week, isn't it?
Okay, so we will know presumably soon after people are listening to this.
Yeah, and even if those matches don't matter massively in and of themselves, they'll be very valuable indicators for where Southgate's leaning, I think, for the tournament.
Okay. Steve Hankey, anything else?
No, it's good.
Great. Well, John Mackenzie, thank you.
Thank you.
Liam Twomey, thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Please go and read all of Liam's work on The Athletic. Very valuable. Steve Hankey, thank you.
You're welcome.
And, of course, to producer Don. Thank you, Don. Yes, there's a hand there. Maybe you can see that hand. Take care, everyone. We'll be back next week with more. Hopefully we'll have fixed our technical problem and we can return Seb Stafford Bloor. Although I've had a lovely week. So we'll see. See you later. Bye.